The shock was the jump of my pulse. My nerve came back. To line up with Foster against Blome and his gang, that would be great. "All right, old man," I replied. "We're going after them, then?" He only nodded. After breakfast, I watched him clean, oil, and reload his guns. I didn't need to ask him if he expected to use them. Without any hesitation, I followed Captain Neal's orders. Foster and I were to enter town together, but he planned to circle around and enter from the back of the Hope So. Meanwhile, I was to hurry ahead and post Morton and his men, gather intel on the gang, and be at the Hope So when Foster arrived. I didn't need to ask if I could use my gun. I already intended to. We left camp and headed towards town. It was almost noon when we parted ways. I approached town from the direction of Barclay's ranch. When I arrived, there was a crowd surrounding the ruins of Foster's house. It was nothing but a pile of crumbled adobe bricks and burnt logs, still smoking and hot. No one had attempted to dig through the rubble. The curious crowd was convinced that Foster was buried under the debris. One thing about the night assault stuck with me. 3 rustlers were found dead in the daylight, killed by random shots. Others involved in the attack were also injured. I suspected that Morton and his men had taken advantage of the darkness and chaos to shoot some extra rounds that weren't part of the plan. From there, I made my way to town. As I expected, Morton and Zimmer were hanging out in front of the Hope So, accompanied by some unsavory characters. At that point, Morton's gang hadn't come under suspicion. He was eager for news about Foster, and when I told him the plan, he became as cool, dark, and grim as any man of my kind could have wished. He sent Zimmer to gather the others in their group. Then he shared a few details with me, but he didn't confirm or deny my suspicions about the 3 rustlers' deaths. Blome, Bo Snecker, Hilliard, and Pickens, the ringleaders of the gang, were painting the town red to celebrate Foster's death. Everyone at the party got drunk except for old man Snecker, who they teased for having cold feet. They were all too happy to pay attention to the old rustlers' warnings or do any more shooting. The party lasted until 2 in the morning. The next day, after 11, Blome and his gang appeared one by one with their followers. The excitement had died down, and Ranger Foster was no longer in the way. Linrock was open and free again. However, Blome seemed sullen and unresponsive to his comrades and admirers. When I arrived, the whole gang, except for old man Snecker, was gathered in the Hope So saloon. I asked Morton if Zimmer would be clever enough to bring his outfit in 1 or 2 at a time, and he reassured me. Then we went into the saloon. There were about 60 or 70 men inside, with more than half openly supporting Blome's gang. The rest were either of questionable character or secretly wanting to help any cause against the rustlers. I could tell from their shadowed faces, tense bodies, and overall unease. The windows were open and the light was clear. Few men smoked, but all had a drink before them. The conversation was subdued, and I surveyed the scene, picking out a spot close to Foster when he entered. Eventually, Zimmer and a man entered and went to the bar. Other men came and went, and Blome, Bo Snecker, Hilliard, and Pickens sat at a table in the light of the open windows. I recognized the faces of the last 2, but Morton had to inform me of their names. Pickens was small, scrubby, dusty, sandy, and mottled, resembling a rattlesnake. Hilliard was a towering figure with a bronzed complexion, a massive mustache, and piercing hollow eyes that gave off an intimidating aura. As soon as I laid eyes on him, I couldn't help but think that he looked like a grave robber. Bo Snecker was a different story altogether. He was a lean, mean, hard-looking young man with a dangerous air about him, as if he was too wild and reckless to have any sense of caution or fear. And then there was Blome, who looked like he had just crawled out of a ditch somewhere. He used to be a handsome fellow, but now his face was swollen and discolored, and his eyes were clouded with shame and regret. He had tried to drown his sorrows in drink, but it hadn't worked. He knew that he had failed as a gunman and that his reputation had been tarnished forever. As we waited for Foster to arrive, the rest of the men milled around lazily, chatting and joking with each other. They were all still half asleep and didn't seem to realize the gravity of the situation. But I knew better. I knew that Foster was a master of surprise and that he would catch them off guard. I kept my eyes peeled for any signs of trouble and tried to stay alert. But I couldn't help feeling sorry for poor Blome. I knew that his time was running out and that he was about to face a swift and merciless ranger who would show him no mercy. In the end, it all happened so fast that I could barely keep up. Foster burst into the room like a whirlwind, and chaos erupted all around us. Blome was the first to go down, of course, but he wasn't the only one. The rest of the men fought back fiercely, but it was no use. Foster was too quick, too deadly, and too determined to let anyone escape. In the end, it was just me and him, standing alone amidst the carnage. I knew that I had to be careful, or I would end up like the rest of them. But I also knew that I had to take a stand and fight for what I believed in. And so, with a heavy heart, I drew my gun and prepared to face my fate. I knew that Foster had the ability to take out Blome's comrades at the table in the blink of an eye if he wanted to. My strategy was to keep an eye on his outside partners. This proved to be the right move, as it allowed me to save Foster's life. As time passed, the ranger still hadn't shown up, and I began to feel uneasy. Could he have been stopped? I dismissed the thought. Who would have been able to stop him? The wait felt longer than it actually was, and the tension in the room was palpable. Morton was clearly feeling the pressure, and the other men looked strained and anxious, as if they were anticipating something terrible. I caught Blandy's eye on me, and I didn't like the look in it. I made a mental note to keep an eye on him. Blandy, the bartender at Hope So, was someone I didn't trust. I paused to clear my throat and catch my breath. He was, I replied ambiguously to Gwen's question. I didn't want to give away too much information just yet. I kept my gaze moving around the room, taking in the half-circle of bearded, swarthy men around Blome's table. The four rustlers brooded, perhaps vaguely, spiritually, listening for a knock. Bo Snecker, the reckless youth, played with a flower he had, putting the stem in his glass, then to his lips, and finally into the buttonhole of Blome's vest. Hilliard, big and gloomy, had eyes that seemed to see the hell where I expected he'd soon be. And lastly, the little dusty, scaly Pickens looked ready to leap and sting someone. The room was tense, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. During a lull in the conversation, Pickens spoke up, addressing someone named Jack. "Drink up and come out of it," he said. "Everyone has an off day. You've gambled long enough to know that every guy gets called out eventually. And since Foster is cashed, why do you care?" Hilliard nodded his head in agreement, but his eyes seemed lifeless. Bo Snecker let out a laugh, which sounded no different than any other boy's laugh. I suddenly remembered that he was the one who had killed Dempsey. Sweat began to bead on my forehead. Would Foster ever come? "Jim, the old man, has cold feet, and he's given them to Jack," Bo said. "It's nothing to lose your nerve once. Didn't I run like a scared jackrabbit from Foster? Watch me if he comes to life, as the old man hinted." "Maybe Foster wasn't in the adobe at all," someone else said. "Oh, that's a joke. I saw him in bed. I saw his shadow. I heard his shots coming from the room. Jack, you saw and heard the same as me." "Sure, I know the Ranger's cashed," Blome replied. "It's not that. I'm just upset, boys." "Deader than a doornail in hell," Pickens exclaimed, lifting his glass. "Here's to Lone Star Foster's ghost, and if I saw it this minute, I'd ask it to waltz with me." Suddenly the back door swung open with a violent force, and Foster burst through the doorway. He was huge, towering over everyone like a giant. Someone let out a strange, harsh cry, and Pickens dropped his glass. The room fell silent, and for a brief moment everyone stood frozen. Foster stood with both hands out and down, leaning forward in a way I had never seen him do before. He looked like a greyhound ready to pounce. But it wasn't just his body that was poised for action. His spirit and his nerve were there too, like lightning about to strike. Blome remained silent, looking pale and frightened. As soon as he realized it was the Ranger, not Foster's ghost, Blome's whole body shook as if he had been jolted out of a trance. His comrades sat motionless, but Hilliard and Pickens quickly dove under the table without rising. The others cursed and muttered, sliding and pressing back, but nobody moved to help Blome. Bo Snecker, however, stayed close to Blome, his face as white as a sheet. Blome slowly stood up, almost instinctively, as if he didn't expect his first movement to trigger any action. Snecker sat on the edge of his chair, feet firmly planted on the floor, his eyes burning holes in his pale face. Although he was staunch and fearless, he didn't think, while Blome knew he was facing death and had no chance of surviving. This was more than just a fight or taking stock. It was the pitiful stand of a criminal against a powerful law. Blome looked like a trapped wolf about to start a savage action, but he was equally weak and helpless. This was a lesson for the border of Pecos County. The most notorious outlaw was now a coward, unable to even draw his gun and certain of his own doom. However, that moment, which seemed so long, was actually very short and had to end. Blome made a sudden movement with his shoulder and arm, causing Snecker to react quickly. Foster's actions were too fast to follow, but I saw his gun wave up and fire twice with a loud boom. Blome doubled over and fell to the floor. Snecker fired his gun as well, hitting Foster, which made me feel sick. Foster did not flinch, but Snecker's left hand went to his right arm, which had been shattered by Foster's bullet. Blood streamed everywhere, and Snecker's screams turned into curses as he went down on his knees to retrieve his gun. Someone from the crowd warned Snecker that he was courting death, but Foster pleaded with him to surrender and promised clemency. However, Snecker continued to reach for his gun. Just as I turned my head, I saw the bartender aim a huge gun at Foster. I acted quickly and shot the bartender just in time, but he had already hit Foster. The ranger staggered but managed to right himself. Without hesitation, I wheeled around to face the danger once again. As Bo Snecker stumbled forward with his gun, a member of the crowd fired a shot, signaling chaos. People frantically ran for cover as the sound of gunfire and bullets whistling through the air filled the room. I quickly pushed Foster behind the bar, accidentally tripping over Blandy in the process. When I stood up, I saw Foster with a gun in each hand, ready for a fight. The room was consumed by smoke, making it difficult to see. Morton and his group were also armed and engaged in the battle. The fight quickly spilled out into the street, and Foster and I ran out amidst the chaos. As we ran, we heard gunshots coming from all directions, and it seemed like Morton's group was chasing rustlers. Suddenly, Foster collapsed in front of me, and I realized he had been shot. He was pale and covered in blood, and I thought he wouldn't make it. However, Foster miraculously rebounded from his weakness and continued to fight with a renewed energy. He didn't even use his guns anymore, preferring to order surrender and promise protection to those who surrendered. It was as if he had no fear of bullets and was unstoppable. Miss Barkley, who had been listening to my story, was overcome with emotion. However, she urged me to continue, and I went on to describe Foster's bravery and determination. Despite the danger, he never gave up and fought until the end. I couldn't hold him back, and it was difficult to keep up with him. I have no idea how many times he was shot at, but it was numerous. He dragged out this and that rustler and turned them over to Morton for safekeeping. More than once, he protected a cowardly rustler from Morton's summary justice. I described Foster to Miss Barkley in detail, explaining how he appeared to me, his effect on the men, and how the rustlers were appealing to him to save them from the new vigilantes towards the end of the fight. I believed I painted a picture of the ranger that would be etched in her memory forever. If she was a hero worshipper, she would have had her fill. One thing that was strange to me was the singular exultation I felt recalling Foster's look, his wonderful, cold, resistless, inexplicable presence, and his unquenchable spirit that was both deadly and merciful. Other men would have killed where he saved. I remembered this magnificent spiritual something about him, strongest in the sound of his voice as he appealed to Bo Snecker not to force him to kill. Then I recounted how we left a dozen prisoners under guard and went back to the Hope So to find Blome where he had fallen. Foster's bullet had cut one of the petals of the rose Snecker had playfully put in the rustler's buttonhole, bright and fatal target for an eye like Foster's. Bo Snecker lay clutching his gun, his face set rigidly in that last fierce expression of his savage nature. There were 5 other dead men on the floor, and significant of Foster's unknown allies' work, Hilliard and Pickens were among them. Foster and I headed back to camp then, I concluded. We didn't speak a word on the way out. As soon as we arrived at camp, Foster told me to scram and leave him be. He looked like death warmed over. I obliged and wandered off a bit, but not too far. I knew what was up with him, and it wasn't no bullet wound. I was close by when he started to have his moment and fought through it. It's funny how some fellas can't handle the sight of blood. Never really bothered me much. I reckon I'm still human, though. I sure did feel a mighty fine sense of satisfaction when I put that bullet through Blandy's thick skull, and I'll always feel that way about it. But Foster, he's a different breed altogether. Chapter 12. Foster lay in a cool, shaded glade, surrounded by towering rocks that served as our lookout. Despite his slumber, he seemed uneasy. The makeshift bandage I had fashioned from dirty rags was stained with dried blood, giving him a ghastly appearance. Green flies swarmed around him, buzzing incessantly. Even though he was a big man, he looked vulnerable and in worse shape than I had let on. When Miss Barkley caught sight of him, she gasped and clutched her chest in shock. "Girls, keep quiet," I whispered urgently. "I don't want him to wake up suddenly and find you here. Go around the rocks and wait for me to call you." They did as I asked, and I knelt down next to Foster, gently shaking him awake. He stirred immediately. "Hey there," I greeted him. "You want some water?" He blinked at me, then asked, "Water or champagne?" I stared at him incredulously. "I've got some champagne behind the rocks," I offered. "Weren't you listening?" he grumbled. "Water, you crazy fool." He looked parched and agitated like a wild coyote in the desert. Reaching for the canteen, I suddenly thought of how pleased Miss Barkley would be to attend to him. But I hesitated and withdrew my hand. "Hold on a minute," I said to myself before finally mustering the courage to speak up. "Vaughn, listen. Miss Barkley and Gwen are here." He jolted so violently that I had to press him back down. "What? She's been here the whole time? Tim, you didn't double-cross me?" he asked, clearly out of his mind. "No, Foster," I exclaimed, trying to reassure him. "It was just a pure accident." He seemed half dazed, but his eyes were filled with an intense, haunting expression. "Fool! Can't you make it easier for her?" he cried out. "This will be tough for Diane," I said, trying to ease the situation. "She needs to know things." "Ah," Foster breathed, sinking back. "Make it easier for her, Tim. You're a damn schemer. You've given me the double-cross, and now she's going to suffer." "We're both in a bad situation," I replied, my words slurring slightly. "I have some crazy ideas. I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place, and I'm just about ready to give up. But still, I think you should talk to Miss Barkley, even if you can't speak clearly." "Okay, Tim," Foster responded quickly. "But man, don't I look terrible, covered in dirt and blood?" "Well, if she's willing to hold your battered face in her lap, then you know she loves you," I said, trying to lift his spirits. "Don't worry too much. I'll bring the girls over." As I walked away, I heard him groan. I went around the rocks and found the girls. "Come on," I said. "He's awake, but he's a little out of it. He gets feverish sometimes, but it won't last long." I led Miss Barkley and Gwen back to our little campsite. Unfortunately, Foster had gotten worse in the meantime. The foolish man had removed his bandage, causing his wound to reopen and attracting flies that he was too weak to swat away. As we approached him, his wild and captivating eyes rolled in his head. "Who's that?" he demanded. "Take it easy, old man," I responded. "I've brought the girls." Miss Barkley trembled like a leaf in the wind. "So you've come to watch me die?" Foster asked in a deep, hollow voice. Miss Barkley shot me a look of terror. "He's delirious," I explained. "Once we clean and cool his wound, he'll be fine." "Oh!" cried Miss Barkley, dropping to her knees and casting aside her gloves. She cradled Foster's head in her lap. When I saw her tears falling on his face, I felt like a villain. She leaned over him for a moment, and one of her tender hands brushed against the flow of fresh blood without flinching. "Gwen," she said, "bring the scarf from my coat. There's a veil, too. Bring that. Tim, get me some water and pour it into the pan there." "Water," whispered Foster. She gave him a drink. Gwen brought the scarf and veil, then retreated to a nearby stone and sat down. The sight of blood had made her a little pale and weak. Miss Barkley's hands trembled and her tears continued to fall, but neither hindered her tender and skillful dressing of the bullet wound. Foster said many nonsensical things. "But why did you come? Why are you being so kind when you don't love me?" "Oh, but I do love you," Miss Barkley whispered brokenly. "How do I know?" "I'm here, I'm telling you." There was a moment of silence during which she continued to bathe his head and he continued to watch her. "Diane," he suddenly exclaimed. "Sure, sure," he muttered, rubbing his throbbing head. "But that ain't gonna stop this pain." "I hope it helps," she replied sympathetically. "Kiss me then, that'll do it," he whispered. Without hesitation, she leaned in and pressed her lips to his forehead right above the bullet wound. "Not there," he corrected. And then, as if pulled by an invisible force, she kissed him on the lips. I couldn't look away, even though it felt like prying. That kiss was something else, something raw and beautiful. Foster looked like he was in a trance, while Diane's face was as white as snow. After she pulled away, she seemed stunned, unable to move. Foster lay there like he was dead. I got up and went over to Gwen, putting my arm around her. "There are others," I reminded her gently. "What's going to happen?" she asked, her voice quivering. and then she started to cry softly. I wished I could tell her everything that was going on, but I didn't even know myself. It felt like something terrible was about to happen. Then Foster spoke again, his voice hoarse and different. I strained to hear what he was saying. "Diane, you know how hard this is for me, right?" "Yes, I know," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You figured out about your father, haven't you?" "I've known for a while that you two were going to clash," she admitted, "but maybe it won't be so bad. Maybe you can bring us together." He shushed her. "Don't talk anymore, you're too worked up right now." "No, listen," she insisted. "I know you and my father are going to fight, but he's not what he seems, and I know that better than anyone." "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice urgent. She looked like she was being pulled towards him, like a moth to a flame. "I feel ashamed to say it, but he has been greedy, sly, unprincipled, and dishonest," Foster confessed. Diane interrupted, trying to calm him down, but Foster continued to explain that her father was the chief of the gang that he was trying to dismantle. Diane was in disbelief and called out to her companions for help. Gwen and Tim tried to comfort her while Foster took a moment to collect himself. When they returned to the group, Foster appeared to have regained his composure, and Diane seemed to have regained some color in her cheeks. However, when Foster mentioned that he had been dreaming, Diane blushed with embarrassment. Suddenly, Foster announced that the truth could no longer be hidden from Diane, and revealed that her father was the leader of the gang of rustlers that he had been investigating. Diane was shocked, but she was also brave and demanded that Foster tell her everything. Reuben Darling was the right-hand man of my cousin, or so I was told by Foster. Miss Barkley overheard but didn't believe it. Foster's voice was husky as he turned away, and I wished I could have lied to her. But the truth was written all over my face, and she collapsed as if she had been shot. I caught her and laid her on the grass while Gwen worked over her. Foster stood aloof, hoping she would never regain consciousness. When she did, she cried, moaned, and talked frantically. Foster staggered away while Gwen and I tried to calm her down. We could only prevent her from hurting herself. When her emotions subsided, I left Gwen with her and went away for a while. Upon my return, Miss Barkley had regained her composure. She stood leaning against the rock where Foster had been and was more beautiful than ever before. She asked where Foster was, but her tone and look didn't suggest the beseeching agony I had expected. I said I would find him, and he came back with me. When they faced each other again, they were both different. Miss Barkley asked what Foster had to do, and he told her sternly. "The criminals outside of my own family don't concern me now. But can my father and cousin be taken without bloodshed? I want to know the absolute truth," said Miss Barkley. Foster knew that they could not be, but he could not tell her so. She then turned to me and asked for my opinion. My part in the situation grew harder. It hurt me so that it made me angry, and my anger made me cruelly frank. "No, it can't be done. Barkley and Darling will be desperately hard to approach, which will make the chances even. So if you must know the truth, it'll be your father and cousin to go under, or it'll be Foster or me, or any combination luck breaks, or all of us." Miss Barkley's self-control seemed to fly to the four winds. She flung herself down before Foster against his knees, clasped her arms round him. "Good God, Miss Barkley, you mustn't do that," implored Foster. He tried to break her hold with shaking hands, but he could not. "Listen, listen," she cried, and her voice made Foster and Gwen and me also still as the rock behind us. "Hear me. Do you think I beg you to let my father go for his sake? No, no, I have gloried in your ranger duty. I have loved you because of it. But some awful tragedy threatens here. Listen, Vaughn Foster. Do not you deny me as I kneel here. I love you. I never loved any other man, but not for my love do I beseech you. There is no help here unless you forswear your duty. Forswear it. Do not kill my father, the father of the woman who loves you. Worse and more horrible it would be to let my father kill you. It's I who make this situation unnatural, impossible. You must forswear your duty. I can live no longer if you don't. I pray you." Her voice had sunk to a whisper, and now it failed. As she wrapped herself around him, her hair falling loose, her face turned upward, white and exhausted, her arms blindly encircling his neck, she was a vision of love, surrender, and irresistible appeal. Even without her beauty, she would have been remarkable. But with it, how could Foster have resisted? She was like a delicate snow-white flower, suddenly shattered and ruined. In that moment, she was everything that made a woman helpless, mysterious, and sacred, everything that made her more than any other thing in life. Until then, my eyes had been fixed on her alone. But when she tried to lift her face and he drew her up, and their two white faces met and seemed to merge into something ecstatic, awesome, and tragic, I saw Foster. He was a god, a man as beautiful as she was. They might as well have been the only two people in the world standing alone in the heart of a desert with nothing but their love and their pain. It was a solemn and profound moment for me. I faintly grasped how enormous it must have been for them, but all the while the crucial matter at hand pounded in my mind. Had they forgotten while I remembered? Perhaps it was only a moment that he held her. Perhaps it was my own agitation that conjured up such swift and whirling thoughts. But if my mind sometimes betrayed me, my eyes never did. I thought I saw Diane Barclay die in Foster's arms. I could have sworn his heart was breaking, and mine was on the brink of breaking too. The beauty of the couple was undeniable. He appeared strong yet shaken, while she was tender and hopelessly appealing in her broken state. If I were in Foster's shoes, I would have forsaken everything for her. I couldn't help but feel his torture, temptation, and narrow escape. I saw the beautiful light on his face, as well as his ghastly ashen complexion with shaking hands that released her only to draw her back in convulsions. It was the saddest sight I had ever witnessed, the death of happiness. He had to ruin the life of the woman he loved and who loved him. I was on the verge of pulling them apart when Gwen dragged me away. Her hold on me made me feel what Miss Barclay must have felt for Foster. But when it was my own feeling, it was different. Despite my schemes and tricks to bring them together, I had an undefined fear of their embrace. However, when Gwen leaned on me and held me tight, I was glad to be led away and have a chance to regain my composure. But would I have that chance with Gwen still in the equation? Some purpose, some motive was being born within me, and I instinctively feared Gwen because I loved her. This soft, fragile creature might be harder to move than the ranger, but could she sense my yet-to-be-formed motive? Suddenly, a wave of calm washed over me, and I was able to hide my true feelings. "What's wrong with you, Tim?" Gwen asked urgently. "Can't we leave this awful place and focus on our own happiness?" "I suppose we should," I replied, struggling against her alluring charm. I knew I had to keep my mouth shut, or else I would reveal my true feelings. "You look different, Tim. I don't want you to kiss me with those closed lips. Smile and kiss me," she pleaded. "You're so cold and distant, you're giving me chills." "I'm shaken up, dear. Let me be alone to think things through," I said, trying to break free from her embrace. But she held on tighter, sensing my discomfort and the turmoil inside me. Women are so intuitive, I thought to myself. I knew I had to get away quickly before I lost control. Gwen's loving gaze met mine as her hands slid down my shoulders, behind my neck, and locked there like steel bands. This was my test. Would it be as difficult as Foster's had been? I prepared myself for the worst and swore that I would remain strong no matter what. Gwen let out a cry that pierced my heart, and then she was pressed up against me. Her chest was heaving against mine, and her eyes, now dark as night, were searching my soul. She saw more than I knew, and with her tight embrace she confirmed my fears. Then she kissed me with a passion that had nothing to do with girlhood or coquetry. It was a woman's passion to blind and tame. The intensity of her kisses made me feel like a tiger, and it was that tiger that prevented me from succumbing to her allure. "I'm your promised wife, Tim," she whispered desperately. "You said soon. I want it to be tomorrow." All the subtlety, intelligence, cunning, charm, and love that made up a woman's power were in her plea. It was torture to hear, and I felt like I was being pulled in two different directions. If the calamity had been mine alone, I might have laughed it off and taken Gwen at her word. But I had a responsibility to Foster. I told her in short, husky sentences what depended on Foster, that I loved the ranger service but loved him more, that his character and life embodied the service I loved, that I had ruined him, and now I would take his place and do his work, even if it meant risking my life. "It's great of you, dearest," she cried, "but the cost. If you kill one of my kin, I'll shrink from you. If you're killed, oh, the thought is dreadful. You've done your share. Let Foster or another ranger finish it. I swear I'm not pleading for my uncle or my cousin for their sakes. If they're vile, let them suffer." "Gwen, it's all about you," I exclaimed. "My dreams were shattered when I realized that I won't be able to show you my beautiful home with its oranges, mossy trees, and mockingbirds. It's a pity that you won't be able to come and see it now." But Tim, there's still a slight chance that I can do the job without—" Gwen trailed off. Before she could finish her sentence, she let go of me, and I quickly drew her towards the stone. I cursed the day I ever met Neil and got involved in the service. Gwen's arch prettiness and sweet charm were nowhere to be found. She looked like she was suffering from a desperate physical injury. Her final breakdown showed that I was lost to her, no matter what. As she sank on the stone, I had my supreme wrench, leaving me numb, hard, and in a cold sweat. "Don't betray me, I'll forestall him. He's planned nothing for today," I whispered hoarsely. "Gwen, you are the dearest, gamest little girl in the world. Remember that I loved you even if I couldn't prove it your way. It's all for his sake. I'm to blame for their love. Someday my act will look different to you. Goodbye." Chapter 13. I sprinted down the rugged slope with a fervor that felt like I was possessed by demons. The wind roared in my ears, but there was another sound mixed in that I couldn't identify. When I reached a level surface, I kept running, but it felt like something was pulling me back. I gradually slowed to a walk, bewildered by this new sensation that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was as if one side of my mind was fixed on a particular goal, while the other was a jumbled mess of thoughts and sensations. I couldn't calm down, no matter how hard I tried. Eventually I found myself hurrying again, almost without realizing it. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone chasing me. The action of running seemed to ease the burden of my oppressive state, so I continued on, picking up speed as I went. As I journeyed further, the task at hand became increasingly difficult. By continuing on this path, I would be forsaking love, happiness, and the potential for success in life. I was making this choice, but it wasn't one I had made absolutely. I knew I needed to be completely certain before proceeding. A clear warning thought came to me, telling me that the work I was pursuing so fervently could not be accomplished with the mindset I currently had. I clung to this thought. Multiple times I slowed my pace and even stopped altogether, but eventually I trudged on. Finally, as I crested a small hill, I saw Linrock laid out before me, vibrant and lush. It wasn't far away, and this sight caused me to come to a definitive halt. There were mesquites on the ridge, and I sought refuge in their shade. It was noon, and the sun beat down mercilessly with no breeze to offer relief. It was here that I had to face my inner turmoil. I had lived a life full of adventure, but never had I struggled so hard to comprehend myself and my situation. I was not the same man I had once been, and I couldn't seem to revert back to that person. The reason for this was clear. It was Gwen Langdon, the vivacious and mischievous girl who had entranced me. She had transformed over the weeks, still possessing her old charms while acquiring new traits that made her the perfect woman to make my life beautiful. She had become a woman of loyalty, passion, and love. Temptation threatened to overtake me. She had promised to be my wife in just 24 hours. The thought of having her as mine was tantalizing. She was the only woman I had ever truly desired, the only one who had brought out the best in me. As I rode the stagecoach back to Austin, I couldn't help but think about her home, the place where oranges grew and the trees were decorated with gray moss and the mockingbirds sang beautiful melodies. I imagined myself riding through the cotton, rice, and cane fields, arriving at the grand mansion where long-eared hounds would welcome me with their baying and a lovely woman would greet me with a happy smile. I could picture the children, too, Gwen as their mother and myself as their father. It was the kind of life I had always yearned for as a lonely ranger. These thoughts stirred something deep within me, something new and strange that I couldn't quite explain. The temptation of this all-satisfying prospect made me feel physically weak and my spirit faint and low. But why had I turned my back on it? Was it worth it to arrest and jail a few rustlers or to face Barkley and show him my shield and reach for my gun? Was it worth it to kill Darling or to save the people of Linrock from greed, raids, and murder? Was it worth it to please and aid Neil, my old captain of the Rangers, or to save the service to the state? No, 1,000 times no. It was all for Foster, the wonderful man that I had undone by throwing Diane Barkley into his arms. That was my great error. This ranger was the envy and admiration of his peers. He was a remarkable specimen, disciplined, principled, and dedicated to the service. He embodied the spirit of Texas, which stood steadfast against disorder and crime. To us, he was the epitome of what it meant to be a ranger. Despite his unwavering commitment to the law, he was not immune to the charms of a woman. However, he remained resolute in his duties, and no amount of passion could sway him. I, too, had fallen for him, but I knew that my love was futile. As we worked on the Linrock case, it became clear that his career was on the line. If he failed, he would be ruined, and the service would suffer. It was then that I realized that I had to save him, not for love, but for duty. I knew that I would have to take down Barclay or Darling, even if it meant being ostracized by Gwen Langdon. I had no illusions about our relationship. I knew that I had to let him go, and in doing so I felt a coldness in my soul. But I was willing to make that sacrifice for the greater good. After a period of regret, pain, and darkness, I emerged bitter and callous, ready for a difficult and deadly mission. I forgot about Miss Barclay, and even Gwen became a distant memory. Instead, my mind was consumed by thoughts of Snecker, Barclay, and Darling, all with their own menacing possibilities. The thrill of the manhunt returned, more intense than ever before. When I arrived in Linrock around 1 o'clock, the streets were deserted. I headed straight to the hall where Morton and Zimmer were keeping watch over the prisoners. They seemed restless and anxious, and I soon learned that only half of the original number of prisoners remained. Morton claimed they had escaped, but I wasn't sure whether to believe him. I tried to ask more questions, but Morton and Zimmer were eager to speak their minds. They demanded to know where Foster was, and I explained that he was out of town and unable to act. They were pleased to hear this, as they had grown tired of waiting. The gang had already split, and if they acted quickly, they could prevent them from reuniting. Old man Snecker had shown up that day and was drawing the gang back together. He was furious after Bo's death and would be a dangerous opponent if he became fully involved. He was currently at the Hope So with a dozen other gang members and was the only known leader left. "We need to get him," I said, looking around the group of men. "If we catch him, we can finally break the Rustler gang for good." "He sent word down here demanding we release our prisoners or there'll be a damn bloody fight," one of the men reported. "We haven't given our answer yet. We were hoping Foster would show up, but now we're glad you're back." "I'll take care of the answer," I replied quickly. "But first, do you know if Barclay and Darling are at the ranch?" "They were there an hour ago," the man confirmed. "Zimmer saw Dick." "Good. Do you have any horses we can use?" I asked. "Sure, the ones outside belong to us," he said. "Great. I need you to take a man with you and ride around the back roads up to Barclay's house. Wait under the trees until you hear me shoot or yell, then come fast," I instructed. The man's face went pale. "So that's where the scent leads," he muttered. "We always wondered, half believed, but no one had any nerve to say anything." "Can I count on you?" I asked. "Absolutely," he replied, his voice shaking. "Good, that's all. Come out and get me a horse," I said, heading towards the door. As I mounted my horse and rode towards the Hope So, I formulated my plan for dealing with Snecker. I needed to be bold and go straight into the saloon. I'd ask for the Rustler, pretending to have a reply from Morton. Then I'd whisper a message supposedly from Barclay and see if Snecker took the bait. If he did, I could surprise him and kill him, then run for my horse. The plan seemed clever to me, but I couldn't help but worry about the risks. The Rustlers may have seen my involvement in Foster's defense the other day, but that was a risk I was willing to take. There were always risks to face. I arrived at the Hope So saloon knowing that I had been spotted. Despite feeling cold, I was also exhilarated. Walking into the saloon, I saw that it was full of men, with some behind the bar. Blandy's place had not been filled. As I entered, every face turned towards me, scowling and dark. I needed my nerve to speak up, calling out for Snecker. However, nobody moved. I scanned the crowd, but did not see Snecker. "I'm in a hurry," I said. "Bill ain't here," replied a man at the table closest to me. "Are you coming from Morton?" "No, but I'm not yelling this message," I retorted. The Rustler got up and strode towards me. "Word from Barclay," I whispered, and he stared at me. "I'm in his confidence. He's got to see Bill at once. Barclay sends word he's quit, he's done, he's through. The jig is up, and he means to hit the road out of Linrock." "Bill'll kill him sure in hell," muttered the Rustler. "But we all said it'd come to that. And what did Darling say?" "Darling, why, he's dead, didn't you hear? Reckon Barclay shot him." The Rustler cursed and clenched his fist. "When did Darling get it?" "A little while ago, I don't know how long. Anyway, I saw him lying dead on the porch, and say, Pard, I've got to go. Send Bill up quick as he comes. Tell him Barclay wants to turn over all his stock and then light out." I backed towards the door, and the Rustler remained in a scowling amazement. I had fooled him, but I needed Snecker to arrive soon. I mounted my horse and leisurely trotted up the street. Linrock was a ghost town, with stores barricaded and business at a standstill. However, I did see a few people, a buckboard, and some cattle wandering around. When I reached the edge of town, I turned aside for a moment to take a look at the ruins of Foster's adobe house. It was nothing but rubble, completely destroyed. Foster had left nothing behind that could have been of any use to him. I continued on my way up to the ranch, my mind eager for distractions to escape the grim reality of the situation. As I was about halfway across the flat, I heard the rapid clatter of hoofs on the hard road. I turned to see who it was, expecting to see Morton and his man, but it was only one man on a fine bay horse. It was Snecker, and he was in a hurry. I was completely astonished to see him, and I quickly got on my guard. I booted my horse so hard that he reared up, and I pulled out my gun, holding it concealed under my sombrero. This rustler had been giving me trouble, and here he was, galloping towards me alone. I felt a rush of exultation, but then my temper settled, and I waited in breathless suspense. As I sat atop my horse, Snecker rode up beside me and came to a sudden stop. I couldn't help but feel fortunate. I always seemed to have luck on my side during these dangerous dealings. Snecker appeared to be seething with anger, like a volcano ready to erupt. His wide-brimmed hat and thick beard concealed most of his face, except for his fiery eyes that burned with intensity. Both he and his lieutenant had been thrown off balance by the strange message supposedly from Barkley. It was Barkley's name that had lured and fooled these men. "Hey, you're the guy who left a message for someone at the Hope So?" Snecker barked at me. "Yes," I replied calmly, patting my horse's neck with my left hand to keep him still. "Barkley wants me bad, huh?" "I reckon there's only one man who wants you more," Snecker retorted. I met his piercing gaze with a steady stare. This was a rustler who wouldn't be fooled for long. I remained calm and collected, waiting with certainty. "You that cowboy, Tim?" he asked. "I was and I'm not," I replied with a significant tone. Snecker's violent outburst was sudden and explosive. "What the hell?" he exclaimed. "Bill, you're easy." "Who are you?" he demanded hoarsely, his hand already reaching for his gun. I watched Snecker like a hawk, waiting for the right moment to strike. "United States Deputy Marshal, Bill, you're under arrest," I declared. In a fit of rage, he drew his gun, but I was quicker. I shot through my hat and hit Snecker's horse, causing it to buck and throw him off. His foot got caught in the stirrup, and the panicked horse dragged him along for a few jumps before his foot slipped loose. Snecker lay motionless in the road, and I knew my bullet had hit its mark. As I rode into Barkley's courtyard and dismounted, I could hear loud and angry voices coming from inside. Barkley and Darling were having another argument. Luckily, fate was on my side. Though I had no plan, my mind raced with 100 different ideas. The yelling stopped abruptly, and both men emerged onto the porch. I immediately put on my best impression of an impudent, drunken cowboy. "It's just Tim, and he's drunk," Reuben Darling sneered. "I heard horses trotting off," Barkley said. "Maybe the girls are coming. I bet I teach them not to run off again." "Hello, Tim." Barkley seemed friendly enough, despite his haggard appearance. He was in his shirt sleeves, with a gun in his hand that he placed on a table nearby. I rode up to the porch and greeted them briefly, playing the part of a clumsy cowboy dismounting from his horse. As soon as I stood up straight, I knew I had them. It was the moment I had been waiting for, and I was ready. I acted and looked exactly like the cowboy I was pretending to be, even though I was overwhelmed by intense emotions, passion, suspense, and nausea. All I wanted was to get Barkley and Darling together, or failing that, to position myself so I had a chance. I kept my eyes on Barkley's gun and the table, knowing that two of the objects could move at any moment. "What do you want here?" Darling demanded. He was red-faced and sweaty from drinking, but sober enough to know what was going on. "Me? Say, Darling, I ain't fired yet," I replied, my resentment rising. "Well, you're fired now," he replied insolently. "Who do you think you are, firing me?" I strolled up to the porch with a cigarette in my hand and a match in the other. As I lit my cigarette, a voice replied, "I do." And I turned to face Darling. It was clear to me that Barkley was hoping for a confrontation between us. "Ha! You fired me once before and it didn't stick, Darling. You're not as tough as you think." Darling was clearly distracted, lost in his own thoughts. It was obvious that strong forces were at work. Both men were on edge, and I could tell that Darling was close to breaking. Barclay laughed mockingly at my words, which only served to anger Darling more. He stopped pacing and turned his fiery gaze towards me. "Barclay, I won't tolerate this man's impudence." "Come on, Darling, don't be like that," I said. "Barclay knows I'm a good guy, and I've got you figured out, too." "You better leave, Tim," warned Barclay. "We're busy with deals today, and we're expecting visitors." "Sure, I don't want to stick around where I'm not wanted," I replied, taking a drag from my cigarette. I didn't move from my spot, though. Barclay sat in a chair near the door with his gun on the table between him and Darling. It was clear that he didn't want any trouble. "Why did you come here anyway?" Barclay asked me suddenly. "Well, I had some news to share," I said. "Then get on with it," he replied. "Look, Mr. Barclay, I'm a sensitive guy. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings." "If I were to tell Mr. Darling this news, he'd go crazy," I said sarcastically. Darling was angry, but also curious. Barclay probably thought I was drunk, and if I hadn't rubbed Darling the wrong way, he wouldn't have even let me talk. "What's the news?" asked Darling. "You don't have to worry about hurting my feelings." "I'm not so sure about that," I drawled. "It's about the girl you like and the ranger you don't like." Barclay jumped up. "Tim, did Diane go out to meet Foster?" he asked angrily. "Yes, she did," I replied. Darling looked like he was about to choke. Both men were getting excited, moving around and waking up. I waited patiently, keeping my emotions in check. "How do you know she met Foster?" demanded Barclay. "I was there. I met Gwen at the same time," I said. "But why would my daughter meet this ranger?" asked Barclay. "She's in love with him and he's in love with her," I stated plainly. The statement hit them hard. I enjoyed seeing Darling's reaction, but I felt bad for Barclay. He still had his pride, and now he was wondering if his daughter would side against him. He seemed to age right before my eyes. Darling found his voice and cursed Diane, the ranger, Barclay, and me. "You selfish fool!" Barclay cried in bitter scorn. "All you care about is yourself and losing the girl. Think about me, my home, my life." Then it seemed to dawn on Barclay that somehow, through his daughter, he and his cousin would be betrayed. Although I couldn't be sure, it seemed to me that jealousy was the main emotion Darling was feeling. Barclay shoved me off the porch, demanding that I leave. Without checking to see if I would return, he turned to face Darling. They stood close to each other, with Barclay on the other side of the table where the gun sat. This was my chance. I knew I had the upper hand in this game, and it felt like a burst of energy exploded in my brain and spread throughout my body. "You'll never have her!" Barclay exclaimed, his voice full of hatred and menace. "I'd rather see her be Ranger Foster's wife than yours, so help me God." Darling was shocked by this statement, and Barclay took advantage of his confusion. "You made me who I am, Darling," Barclay continued. "I supported you, protected you, and even joined forces with you. But now I'm done. I quit you." Their faces were unmoving, and their passion was like stones. I knew I had to take control of the situation. "Gentlemen," I called out in a clear, authoritative voice, "you're both finished." They turned to face me, and I had my gun pointed at them. "Don't move a muscle, not a finger," I warned them. Barclay understood the danger he was in, but Darling was too consumed by his anger to comprehend the situation. I raised my left hand to show them my shield, which was gleaming in the sunlight. "I am a United States Deputy Marshal in the service of Ranger Foster." Darling howled like a wild animal and made a reckless attempt to grab his gun. But my shot was quick and precise, cutting short his life and his foolishness. Before Darling even stumbled, before he let go of the gun, Barclay jumped behind him, wrapped his left arm around him, and snatched the gun from both of his hands and put it away in a flash. I fired at Barclay, then again, then a third time. All of my bullets went into the nodding Darling's lifted body. Barclay had shielded himself with the corpse. I saw red flashes, puffs of smoke, and heard quick reports. Something stung my left arm. Then I was hit by a light yet impactful blow that knocked me down. The hot lead followed the blow. My heart felt like it was exploding, yet my mind was clear and quick. I got up, leaned on a post by my shoulder, and heard Barclay work the action of Darling's gun. I heard the hammer click and fall upon empty shells. He had used up all of Darling's gun's loads. I heard him curse, defeated. I waited, now cool and confident, for him to reveal himself from behind his bolster. He tried to lift the dead man and move him closer to the table where the gun was, but he found the task too risky. He bent over, peering at me under Darling's arm. Barclay's eyes were those of a man who intended to kill me. There was no mistaking the strange and terrible light in eyes like those. I had more than one chance to aim at them, at the top of Barclay's head, or at a strip of his side. But I had only 2 shells left, and I wanted to be sure. Suddenly I remembered Morton and his man.